You sit at your kitchen table one quiet Tuesday afternoon, your reading glasses perched at the end of your nose, looking through a small pile of papers your solicitor put in front of you just last week. The house is paid off, the mortgage is long gone, and a warm, hopeful thought keeps drifting up into your mind about simply handing it over to the children while you are still here to enjoy it with them. Almost every family I sit with at that kitchen table means well, and yet almost every one of them ends up quietly bleating to me a few years later, asking why the taxman or the council or the care home has come calling anyway. That hopeful little thought is worth a slow, honest look before you act on it. If these unhurried, plain English conversations about family money feel useful to you, I would be honestly grateful if you tap the subscribe button below so the next one finds you without you having to come looking for it. I am a retired financial planner who still keeps an office open 3 days a week, and these longer notes are simply how I share what I would have said if you had sat down with me face to face over a cup of tea. The next few minutes are written for anyone over the age of 55 in this country who owns a home and is quietly wondering what on earth to do with it next. The central idea behind everything we are about to walk through together is this: protection and control almost always matter more than speed when it comes to the family home, and a quiet, well-built structure done in the right order will usually beat a hasty gift every time of the week. You will hear me come back to that exact thought at every turning point of this conversation, because it is the single idea that protects more British families from grief than any tax rule on the statute book. Hold it gently in the back of your mind while we move through the practical bits, and by the end, you will have your own quiet compass for this decision without anyone having to sell you anything. Over the next few minutes, I want to walk you through 7 honest things every older British homeowner ought to sit with before signing a deed that gives a house away, and I would like you to picture each one as if it were happening to someone you love, because in this country, it very often is. We are going to keep the language simple, avoid jargon wherever we can, and unpack any technical phrase in plain English straight after it appears on the page. Some of these thoughts will overlap on purpose, and none of them should ever be taken as a substitute for your own solicitor's quiet advice at the end of the day. The order matters. Each point builds on the one before, so it really is worth staying with me the whole way through. The first thing to understand is one of the most common traps I see, and it goes by the very dull-sounding name of gift with reservation of benefit, which is just the technical way of saying you gave something away, but kept on using it as though it was still yours. Imagine your mum, a spry 73-year-old who still does her own garden, deciding to put the family home into her son's name, so it will not form part of her estate when she passes away. She carries on living there just as before. She still pays the council tax and the insurance. She never charges her son a penny of rent, and she genuinely believes she has done a clever bit of inheritance tax planning. What she has actually done, in the eyes of HMRC, is nothing of the sort, because the rule quietly says otherwise. The rule is brutally simple. If you give a property away but keep on enjoying it as though you still own it, the taxman treats it as though it never left your estate at all, and your family ends up paying full inheritance tax in the end, as though no gift had ever been made. In HMRC's own written guidance, any retained benefit means the asset remains part of your estate for inheritance tax purposes, no matter whose name sits on the deeds at the land registry. So the very act meant to save 40% in tax quietly fails, and the family is left with a bill they had not budgeted for and a son or daughter sitting on a deed that does them no good whatsoever. It is one of the most common and most avoidable losses I see in this corner of British life. The plain English relief here, where it is genuinely wanted, is for you to keep paying a formal market rate rent to your own child for living in your own home, with a proper written tenancy agreement, a regular standing order paid on the same date each month, and a clear paper trail that any local estate agent would recognise as fair. HMRC will look kindly on arrangements where the donor honestly stops receiving any free benefit from the property, because at that point the gift starts to behave like a proper, clean transfer of value rather than a clever-sounding sham. The phrase worth writing down and keeping by the kettle is this: a gift with reservation almost always reverts to your estate, but a properly rented gift has a chance of standing up properly. The principle to carry in your pocket is that speed feels satisfying, but structure keeps the value safe, and a rushed gift that does not clear the reservation test will quietly drain 40% of that value back out of the family on the day you die. Almost every family I have ever seen lose a hefty sum to the tax office did so because they wanted to do things quickly, and almost every family I have seen keep the value intact did so because they agreed to take a few extra months and get the paperwork right the first time. If the idea of slowing down to protect the family home sits well with you, why not tap the subscribe button in now and let these calm, careful notes arrive in your feed a little more often? The second trap is the famous 7-year rule, and I want to handle it gently because it is genuinely useful when used properly and genuinely painful when it is misunderstood. Potentially exempt transfers, and that is just the technical phrase for lifetime gifts to individuals that can fall outside your estate if you survive long enough. Get a sliding scale of tax relief called taper relief once you have clocked up 3 full years after the gift was made. Whenever someone tells you that giving away a house is easy, the 7-year clock is the very first thing they should be talking about, and the very first thing many of them quietly forget. Picture a 71-year-old widower, I will call David, who gave his daughter the deeds to a small buy-to-let flat, thinking it would neatly tidy his affairs, only to die 18 months later from an unexpected heart attack. Because David did not survive 7 full years after making the gift, the entire value of the flat was dragged back into his estate for inheritance tax purposes, and his daughter ended up writing a check to the tax office that she had not budgeted for at all. The taper relief between years 3 and 7 would have softened the blow if David had lived a little longer, but 18 months simply is not enough, and the family learned the lesson the hardest way I know. The genuine relief here is for a properly planned gift made 7 full years or more before death, because at that point the value falls completely outside your estate for inheritance tax, and the taper relief between years 3 and 7 can step the rate down from 40% to as little as 8% if you fall slightly short of the full term. The simple phrase worth writing down is this: a lifetime gift is not a free pass, it is a clock you start, and the clock usually has to run for 7 full years before the tax office stops counting. If you have a friend or neighbour who talks about gifting a property as though the 7 years magically starts when the deed crosses the desk, do pass them what we have said here and offer them this video. The third piece of the puzzle, and one that catches a lot of people completely off guard, is capital gains tax, which is the quieter cousin of inheritance tax and rarely gets a mention in kitchen table conversations about the family home. People tend to think of capital gains tax as something that only applies to buy-to-let landlords and second homeowners, but it actually applies whenever a gain arises on a property that is not your main private residence, including on a gift that triggers a deemed disposal. The moment a property is given away as a gift, the same rule kicks in, and the person receiving the gift becomes responsible for any tax on the gain that has built up while the donor owned it. Imagine your father bought his terraced house in 1978 for £14,000, has watched the same property now be worth comfortably above £500,000, and decides to hand it across to his 2 children this Christmas as a family blessing. There is no inheritance tax to worry about yet, because he is very much alive, but the moment that deed crosses his desk, a hidden tax bill starts ticking away quietly in the background, and the children become liable for that bill on the day they receive the gift. The capital gains tax calculation is on the uplift from the original purchase price to the current market value, with a modest annual exemption of £3,000 that most ordinary households never quite realise exists. The current capital gains tax rates for residential property sit at 18% for basic rate taxpayers and 24% for higher rate taxpayers, which on a £500,000 gain can easily run into 5 figures before any of it is spent on the family. Your children have 24 months from the end of the month in which they receive the gift to register the gain with HMRC and pay any tax due, and a failure to do so can mean penalties on top of the bill itself. The phrase to keep in your pocket is this: a lifetime gift of property almost always creates a capital gains tax bill that an inheritance would not. The simple relief here, where it really suits your plan, can sometimes be to leave the house to the children through your will instead of during your lifetime, because when someone inherits a property, the taxman resets the cost to the value on the date of death, and the gain that built up during your lifetime quietly evaporates for capital gains tax purposes. There is no comparable uplift for capital gains tax on a lifetime gift, only for inheritance, which is why the timing of the gift matters almost as much as the gift itself in a household of ordinary means. The principle worth sitting with is this: giving things away now creates tax this year, while leaving things in a well-drawn will creates tax only on what happens after the day you die, and the timing of a gift can be worth far more than the gift itself to the people you love. The fourth thing to sit with is something that gets politely ignored until it suddenly cannot be ignored, and that is the way your local council looks at gifts when the time comes to pay for care. Deprivation of assets is the phrase, and underneath that phrase sits a very human rule. If you gave away a property with the aim of avoiding care fees, and the council can show that avoiding care fees was a significant motivating factor, the council can treat the property as if you still owned it for the purposes of the means test. The same two-part test is applied by almost every local authority in England. Was reducing care costs a significant motivating factor, and was a care need reasonably foreseeable at the time of the gift? Imagine a quietly proud 78-year-old I will come back to properly in a moment, who handed her house to her daughter with the very best of intentions and ended up being asked to pay the full care home fee a few winters later anyway. Her daughter was mortified, the care home bill was formidable, and the family had to use the proceeds of the very house they thought they had protected to fund the care their mum needed within just a few years of the deed being signed. The local council carefully ran its standard two-part test, looked at the date of the gift and the date of the care need, and quietly decided the property should still be treated as belonging to Margaret for the purposes of charging her care fees. The genuine relief in this area, where it is right for you, tends to be either to wait until a genuine care need is no longer reasonably foreseeable before making the gift, or to use a carefully drafted trust arrangement that gives you proper independent advice and a fair market rent for the rest of your days. The current upper capital limit in England is £23,250, below which the council will look more closely at helping with care costs, and the higher threshold for full self-funders sits well above that, so a swift transfer of a family home rarely sits below either line for long. The phrase worth pinning above your desk is this: ask whether care is reasonably foreseeable before you sign the deed, because that single question quietly decides whether your local council will let the gift stand or quietly undo it. The principle to write down in plain English is this: gifting a house to dodge future care costs looks shrewd on paper and rarely works in practice, and the council's assessors have heard the same story thousands of times across every county in England. Hold that thought close if you ever feel nudged by a well-meaning relative who insists that the only way to protect the house is to put it in their name this coming weekend, because that early enthusiasm is exactly what the assessors are quietly trained to spot. The right answer, when there is one, almost always involves a properly drawn trust and a properly paid rent, rather than a hurried gift with a hug and a handshake. I want to spend a few minutes with Margaret now, because her story pulls the last few threads into one human life and gives them a proper shape that no list of rules ever really can. Margaret is 74, a widow of 3 years, living alone in a modest semi in Bristol, worth about £350,000, with 2 grown-up children she adores and trusts completely. She had been to see her solicitor exactly once in her life and thought, like most of us quietly do, that the rest of her paperwork was probably already in order. Her son Paul, age 47, lives 2 streets away with his wife and their 2 teenage children, and Margaret thought it would be a kindness to put the house into Paul's name while she was still fit and well, partly to tidy her affairs, and partly because she liked the thought of something concrete already in her son's hands. The family WhatsApp chat had a few encouraging messages, her daughter-in-law was quietly grateful, and the local solicitor did the paperwork at what felt like a reasonable fee on a bright morning in early spring. They signed the deed at Margaret's kitchen table, kept no rent, kept no tenancy agreement, and Margaret carried on living in the house exactly as she always had done for the last 38 years. 2 years later, Margaret had a fall on the kitchen floor, fractured her hip quite badly, and after a stretch in hospital, the doctors and the occupational therapist told her and Paul together that a residential care home would now be the safer place for her to live. Margaret went reluctantly, Paul visited her every other day, and the family settled into a new, gentler rhythm under circumstances nobody had wanted or planned for. The care home bill was £1,000 a week at first, then drifted higher as Margaret's needs grew through that first winter, and the local council began its slow, quiet, means test inquiry into the family's finances. The local council's assessors ran their standard 2-part test, looking first at whether reducing care costs had been a significant motivating factor in the gift, and second at whether a care need had been reasonably foreseeable at the time the deed was signed by Margaret and Paul. The council concluded that Margaret had given away her only valuable asset 2 short years before her care need became reasonably foreseeable, and decided to treat the value of the house as still effectively hers for the purpose of charging care fees. Margaret's son Paul, who now technically owned the house, was told that the council would still expect Margaret to fund her own care from the value of that very same property. The family ended up using the proceeds of the very house they thought they had protected to pay for Margaret's care just a few winters too early, through a structure that provided no protection at all when it was most needed. Margaret had meant well, she had acted out of love, and yet the speed of the gift and the absence of any protective scaffolding around it cost the family exactly what they had hoped to keep for the next generation. I sat with Paul in my office the morning after he got the council's letter, and the quietly sad thing was that every single part of this story could have been different if the family had taken an extra year and asked a slightly different set of questions first. The lesson Margaret's daughter-in-law quietly took from the whole episode was very simple. Love alone does not protect a house, only a proper structure does, and a proper structure almost always involves a solicitor, a trustee, a written agreement, and a slow calendar rather than a quick deed signed over Sunday lunch. I share Margaret's story with you in the hope that her quiet wisdom might reach the kitchen table of your own family before the same piece of paper does. If you know a family currently weighing up exactly this decision, what we are sitting with right now is for them as much as for you. The fifth thing every older homeowner ought to know is the combined inheritance tax allowance that quietly sits behind almost every successful estate plan in this country, and many couples leave a meaningful chunk of it unused simply because their will was never updated when it should have been. The standard nil rate band sits at £325,000 per person, and that figure is frozen at the same level until at least April 2028, with 40% tax charged on anything above it. On top of that, there is the residence nil rate band, which is an extra £175,000 available when a main family home is passed down to direct children or grandchildren, and that figure is similarly frozen until April 2031. A married couple who plan their wills sensibly can therefore pass up to £1 million of family wealth free of inheritance tax, with no need for any lifetime gift at all, no need for any clever trust, no need for any solicitor to do anything more than write the will in the right way and have the couple sign it before two quiet witnesses. The residence nil rate band is an allowance rather than a flat rate, and it only applies when the home is being left to direct descendants such as children, grandchildren, or stepchildren who have been treated as children of the family over many years. The plain English phrase to remember is this: most British couples who pay inheritance tax simply never use the two allowances they were already owed by right. The most important thing to take away from this part of our conversation is that the will sitting quietly in your sock drawer is probably worth far more than any single deed your family is contemplating this year, and a properly drawn will costs very little compared with the family wealth it quietly protects. Would you agree, after sitting with me this long, that a quiet conversation with a solicitor about your will is one of the kindest things you can do for the people you love? And if so, a gentle tap on subscribe will help these careful notes keep arriving without you having to hunt for them at 2 in the morning. The sixth thing to mention is the one that gets fewer column inches but causes the most family heartbreak of all, and that is what happens to a gifted property when the child you gave it to goes through their own life changes, which most of them will, whether we like it or not. Picture a widower I will call Derek, age 70, who gifted his end of terrace house to his only son at a moment when the family felt close and everything looked steady in every direction. Derek was a quiet, proud man who had raised his son on his own after his wife died young, and the gift felt like the natural passing of a baton from one generation to the next without any fuss at all. Derek was devastated a few years later to discover that his son's marriage had broken down, and his former daughter-in-law now had a court-awarded share in the very house Derek thought he had quietly protected for the family across the years. Once a house sits in your child's name, it is no longer your asset, it is theirs, and every risk they face in their own life becomes a risk to that asset as well. Their divorce, their own care needs, their own business debts, and even the claims of creditors who come calling long after you have stepped away. Derek's granddaughter, who had been the unspoken reason for the gift in the first place, now has a complex claim on a property that only ever existed to look after her. The genuine relief, where it suits your family, is to place the property inside a properly drafted trust that names the children as beneficiaries, but keeps the underlying asset under family control, with a small group of trusted trustees, including at least one independent professional, who decide when and how the asset can ever be used. A trust is not a magic wand. It has its own costs and its own paperwork each year, but it does keep the underlying asset quietly beyond the reach of a son's creditors and a daughter's divorce settlement in a way a deed in a single name simply cannot. The phrase to keep by the kettle is this: a name alone rarely provides the family safety you might be hoping for, but a structure often quietly does. The principle to take away from Derek's story is that true protection usually means keeping the asset in a structure rather than in a name, and a name alone rarely provides the family safety you might be hoping for, particularly as families grow and relationships quietly grow with them over the decades. If a member of your own family is currently weighing up whether to put a property into a child's name, perhaps this is the kindest moment to send them what we have sat with here, before the same lessons have to be learned the hard way, as Margaret and old Derek both learned them. I will let that thought rest for a moment before we move on to the last of our 7 points together. The seventh and last thing to think about is the right way to do all of this in the real British world, where the law moves slowly and good advice is worth its weight in gold over many decades of family life. There is rarely a single magic answer that suits every family, and any decent solicitor will tell you that the right answer tends to involve three things: working gently together, rather than fighting against each other for your attention. The first of those three is a properly written will that uses both the standard and the residence nil rate band in full, which costs very little and protects an enormous amount for the people you love. The second is a properly considered lifetime plan that lets you give away some wealth in a way that genuinely clears the 7-year clock without triggering any reservation of benefit, and that lets your solicitor keep the paperwork honest and your family free from HMRC's very long memory indeed. The third is a properly drafted family trust arrangement where life circumstances, relationships, and care needs all quietly point in the same direction, so that the asset looks after the people you love rather than the people they happen to end up with through no fault of their own. The simplest phrase I can offer is this: take the word of a quiet, well-registered solicitor over the word of the most confident person in the family WhatsApp chat, and never let anyone rush you into signing something as large as a house on a Wednesday afternoon. The principle that holds all 7 of these points together is exactly the one I shared with you at the very start. Protection and control almost always matter more than speed when it comes to the family home, and there is no shame at all in taking a year, or even 2, to get the structure right before you do anything significant with the deeds. The right solicitor will not mind the slow pace, and in fact, a good one will quietly thank you for it, and you will find the whole process becomes a conversation rather than a scramble to get the paperwork in before Christmas. If you have stuck with me through every single point, you have just done more careful thinking about this topic than most families manage in a whole decade of put-it-off Sundays. I want to leave you with one quiet, gentle image before we finish, because the theme of protection over speed is easier to hold on to when it has a shape you can picture in your own mind long after the screen has gone dark in front of you. So before we close, sit back in your chair for a moment and let this one simple picture do a little of the work for you, even if you forget every statute I have ever mentioned in the next 20 minutes. The closing thought should not feel like a pitch, and it will not, because the most important idea is also the simplest one, and it does not need to be sold. Picture a fine old oak tree standing at the end of a garden that has been in the same family for 3 generations, the kind of tree that has weathered every storm the village has thrown at it for the last 100 winters and summers. That tree is not flashy, it is not easily moved, and it is not afraid to take its time about putting down deeper roots each autumn, which is precisely why it is still standing when newer, faster-growing plants have already blown over in the first strong gust that came along. The family home, looked after properly, is very much the same kind of tree, and the careful legal structures, the slow paperwork, the patient conversations with your solicitor are simply the deeper roots that keep the whole thing upright long after you are no longer there to tend to it yourself. If there is one person in your life who is just now sitting at their own kitchen table, wondering whether to put their house into a child's name, perhaps an older parent who would rather not make a fuss about money, perhaps a dear neighbour who has recently been widowed and feels quietly lost, perhaps a brother or sister who never quite gets around to sorting these things out, do send them this video with my quiet blessing this week. The right advice, shared gently at the right moment, can save a whole family a great deal of heartache in the years that follow, and there is no clever wording needed in the message you send. A simple, "I thought of you," is more than enough to start the kind of conversation that matters most. Take good care of that oak tree over the coming years. Let its roots go deep while there is still time to do so, and trust that the next generation will be quietly grateful for the steadiness you have left them long after the paperwork has been filed away in the right place. There is no urgency in any of this that cannot wait for a proper conversation at the right pace, and the right pace is almost always slower than we would like in this country. Go gently, look after one another, and you will find most of these decisions take care of themselves when you give them the room they need to breathe.